All right. Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody to this episode of Whiteskinned, podcast with white people talking about whiteness, and about race and social constructs, politics, history, all that good stuff, wherever the conversation flows to. My name is Steve Hintz, and I'm your host. I'm really excited today to be talking to my guest here, a man who's not afraid to throw down the gauntlet when it comes to race and race work and kind of pushing the conversation forward. So my first guest, he's among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. For the past 25 years, he's spoken to audiences all over the country, high school campuses, college campuses, where we first kind of encountered each other here at the University of Arkansas, teaching anti-racist work to different conferences, military, government, all that good stuff. You've written 9 books. He's written 9 books here. The latest book, Dispatches from the Race War. Also Under the Influence, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority and Colorblind, along with your memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. So that was the first kind of introduction for me to your work too. So I'd like to welcome everybody, Tim Wise here to the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on, man. It's great to see you. Really feel honored, coming on short notice and making some time for us. So
absolutely.
I was just, it's funny. Well, we first kind of got in a conversation here at the University of Arkansas when you came to visit. I was in my grad program and just a really good conversation. I was so into it, asking a lot of questions. And a white lady came to me after the show and was like, hey, man, you were hogging up all the space, man. You using your white privilege and kind of taking up all the time. I was like, oh, man, that was the last thing I wanted to hear after the conversation we had. So,
right, sure.
You get reeled back in sometimes here.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, 4th of July just passed. One of your most recent works. I was just, I took a look at it. Obviously, was moved by it. I'm always excited to hear what you have to say and kind of your commentary on things, having such a long history here, and. I think your call for people to come to patriotism and what is patriotism and what does it look like for everybody, and it's kind of a different thing. And how can we move the country, keep moving the country in a better direction? How do you feel like this argument is going? I mean, how do you feel it comes across to folks?
Well, I have a lot of ambivalence around that whole subject of patriotism and such that, in the past, I wrote a piece back during the aftermath of 9/11 that was actually titled Patriotism is Pathology. And the argument there was basically, that I rejected it because it so easily devolves into nationalism and ends up being used to justify war. I still believe that, but I also know that we have to be really careful, those of us on the left and in the social justice, racial justice community, not to completely cede the ground to the right, when it comes to the notion of love of country. And so even though I reject patriotism as a practical matter, because I know it almost always devolves into nationalism, not just here, but in other countries as well, I'm sure. But I also want to say, if we're going to have it, if there's going to be this thing, and we know there is going to be, then we have to carve out a space to say, well, this is the America that we love, This is what we love about the country. And the reality is, look, there are lots of things that I love about the people of this country, the social movement history of this country. The struggle is part of this country's history. And I hate the fact that it's been necessary because of a system of white supremacy, but I love that it emerged and that Black and brown folk have led that struggle, particularly Black folk, for hundreds of years. And some of us who are white folk have been part of it. Like, there's a lot to love and a lot to cling to and to connect to. Sadly, that's not what we normally talk about on July 4th or whatnot. It's not what we normally focus on when we think about love of country. But it's what we ought to, it's also the way I've come to peace with being a Southerner, being someone who's lived in the South my whole life. I could either spend that time hating the South for its provincialism and for clinging to the Confederacy, even 160 years after it fell. I could do that. And I spent a lot of my childhood, trying to run away from having any kind of a Southern accent trying to avoid any kind of acknowledgement of any of that because there was so much shame associated with it. But then I realized, and I tried to remember, you know, that the freedom movement also grew out of this soil, right? And not just the Black-led part of it, but even the white folks that were the strongest allies and co-conspirators in the struggle for racial justice came out of the South. It wasn't just a bunch of Northern kids that came South, sent by their parents in the 60s to free us, you know, and free Black folk in the South. It was Southerners as well. You know, it was Bob Zellner. It was Virginia Foster Durr. It was Ann and Carl Braden. It was people in the South. It was John Fee in Kentucky. It was people who came out of this soil. And so I'm trying to say, look, let's try to the extent possible. And I don't know if it's possible, but I think it's worth the attempt. Try to reclaim that part of the South for those of us who are Southern, but America for those of us who are not, and even for those who are, that is something we should be proud of. And it's different than what those MAGA folks say, right? Because I mean, their thing is they want to make America great again. And what we're saying is we want to make America great really for the first time, drawing on some of the traditions of resistance that are uniquely American in some ways, that are specific to our country, and try to make the country what it said it was. And if we didn't love the country, we wouldn't bother, right? I mean, if we didn't love it, we would just say, screw it, man. We'd go live off the grid in the mountains somewhere and just say to hell with it, right? It's the fact that we do care that makes us fight. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, you know, with that July 4th piece that you referenced and just in general. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really cool kind of way of framing the conversation and providing a bridge maybe for some folks to find that patriotism and to find that excitement about, you know, the founding fathers had this idea unrealized, obviously for most everybody. I mean, you know, it was a thought. And to think that you can create the language around that engages more people who have, you know, been left out of that conversation to see a way in the future, especially the outsized impact that America's had on white supremacy around the world and anti-blackness around the world. Maybe, like you said, that leadership for the movement for the world comes out of here as well. I mean, with some of those conversations.
I mean, in some ways, right. I mean, if the argument is, and I think it is, you'll hear Black folks say this and other folk of color will say it, look, white folks, y'all made the mess. You got to be part of cleaning this up, right? It can't just all fall to Black and brown peoples. And it's true. If you make the mess, you know, like you go into a store and you break it, you bought it, right? If you break the country, you have to take some responsibility for that. And I think on a global level, as you've just said, if the United States has, and we have, you know, exported white supremacy, made it a global brand, and really exported anti-blackness, so much so that, you know, there are Black folk in sub-Saharan Africa today who are bleaching their skin with toxic chemicals and dying from that. That didn't happen 500 years ago. That didn't happen 1,500 years ago. That didn't happen in ancient African civilizations and kingdoms. Just like you have people in Asia, in various Asian nations that are trying to change the fold of their eye to meet Western beauty standards, also using various toxic chemicals to bleach their skin lighter. That too did not happen, you know, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. So if in fact the United States has exported this white supremacy, anti-blackness, and other forms of white supremacy, we do have a unique role in fixing it. Now, having said that, you know, if I were somebody outside the United States, I wouldn't exactly trust Americans to fix it.
Well, sure,
right?
Yeah.
Just like if I'm Black, I don't really trust white people to do all that work. You got to be part of it. You got to be in it. But if I'm Black or brown, I still want to make sure I'm checking on white people. And if I'm living in Nigeria, if I'm living in Chile, if I'm living in Mexico, wherever it is, I want to make sure I'm checking on the U.S. as well and trying to make sure that they're not going it alone, because I don't think we have a real good track record, obviously.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, and you alluded to something too about Black and brown folks having kind of never really having been wrong about issues of racial justice, obviously with the role that has been going on in this country, and knowing, kind of having the answers to a lot of this, just in the simple fact that they know the truth, isn't it? About white supremacy, anti-blackness. Where does that leave you and me as, you know, kind of engaging white folks to the conversation, people who don't even think that this conversation has to take place, but getting people to listen to Black and brown leaders who have a lot of that perspective that we need in order to get out of this situation, but not using our white maleness to kind of have the answer or think we have the answers, but right. You know, what is our role here in the middle?
Well, I mean, there's no, there's no silver bullet that gets people to pay attention or magic words that get people to really take it seriously. I do think, in my experience, the way to try to bring people in is not so much. I mean, we can hit them over the head with a lot of facts and data and statistics and information about systemic racism, and I do that in some of my books. They're heavily footnoted, whatever. Yeah. And we also know what the social psych research says, which is that facts don't change people, right? Like, people actually don't come to the Lord based on facts, so to speak.
Right.
They do it based on their own faith. They do it based on their feeling. And so you have to actually approach people, and it's somewhat counterintuitive, right? The white way of doing things, frankly, the very Eurocentric way of doing things is just like, let me hit you over the head with all these facts. Mm-hmm. I don't have to give you an analysis. I don't have to tell you stories. Narrative doesn't matter, right? It's just this sort of quantitative method. Mm-hmm. And there's value in the quantitative method. I'm not saying it's bad. And I'm not trying to make this essentialist argument that some fools make, which is like science is white. No, science is not white. That's absurd. But the European tradition has a particular way of coming to look at facts and information. Mm-hmm. And I think it clouds our ability to actually see other ways of understanding what is true. It's not always just quantitative. It's learning to hear people's stories. It's learning to actually listen to what people say. It's sharing our own stories. In my experience, I can actually get white folks to think more about systemic racism and white supremacy, white privilege, by telling stories about my own observations of it, rather than just coming up with data. Now, I have the data. If you need the data, I got it, and we can have that conversation. But honestly, like, if I want to talk about systemic racism in the justice system, right? I could give you all these studies, and if you're inclined to not believe them, you'll just say, well, numbers. You can make numbers say anything. Well, right. Really, that's what people say. But if I tell you about all of the times that I was able to get away with shit in the presence of cops, right? The way that I was treated differently, and that my white friends have been treated differently, and then contrast that with the way that I've seen my Black and brown friends treated by cops and by the justice system, even though the anecdotes actually don't prove the point. Anecdotes don't prove points. They illustrate points. Data actually does prove points, but anecdotes actually have more of an impact on us, because human brains have evolved to respond to stories better than data, right? Because data, the quantitative method, is relatively new in human evolution, right? Like that we weren't doing that in the caves, right? We had different ways of communicating. But storytelling goes back to cave painting. Storytelling goes back to the earliest forms of language. And so our brains are better at dealing with that. So sometimes we have to relate to people on a human level and tell stories and be prepared to hear their stories, which is not always easy, particularly if you're talking to a white person who's really deep in denial, right? So I think it's very much about narrative. It's about sharing stories. It's about being open to listening, finding out why people are blocking the truth that you're trying to offer, or that Black folks are trying to offer. There's a reason. Somebody might be blocking that because they're deeply invested in the system as it is, and they don't want to lose advantage. Some people might be blocking it because they just are so afraid of acknowledging injustice, because then they'll feel on the hook and they don't know what to do. That's a different kind of blocking, right? Somebody might be blocking it because they were raised in a really overtly racist kind of home. That's a different kind of blocking. Somebody else may be blocking it because they don't want to feel bad about themselves, right? They're afraid that if they acknowledge a systemic injustice, that makes them a bad person. That's a different kind of blocking. So you sort of have to engage people and find out where they are, if you're going to try to figure out what they might need to come from point A to point B or C or wherever you're at.
It sounds like, too, I mean, a lot of that emotion work, obviously, those emotions are re-stimulated and used to kind of sway people and to kind of influence people and keep people separated. And it's real intentional work, right? I mean, a lot of those things you talked about were intentionally kind of put in the system in the beginning to keep people, those stories and the emotion work. If these people get out of here, they're going to come kill you. They're going to come rape your wives. They're doing these things. The stories about, all that emotion work was laid in so heavily, and it's still reinforced a lot in our media and all that stuff. So that's kind of a systemic pressure, isn't it? From, kind of a socialized pressure as well. So is that needed? Is that level of socialized pressure needed to be lifted in order to really influence? Or are you talking about like individual work between people? How far can that get us? I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, I think trying to completely undo socialization around, racialized fear is that's the work of many lifetimes, right? I don't anticipate that we're going to be able to undo the psychology of white supremacy entirely in any short period of time, because this is hundreds of years and multiple generations of ingrained conditioning, propaganda, et cetera. And I think, I can't prove this, but I think it's reasonable to conclude that to some extent, that fear, that anxiety around white domination and the fear of what happens if we as white people don't maintain it is transmitted not just in terms of what we teach our children and grandchildren on down through the generations. I think it's actually transmitted at a cellular level, like all this research on epigenetics, right, which talks about the intergenerational transmission of trauma for Black and brown peoples, right? That there's a biological encoding of trauma, which is transmitted to children. And my argument would be, well, if that's true, and science is starting to tell us that, we've seen research in England that's proven that, research out of Emory in Atlanta that's actually shown that as well. If trauma can be transmitted, why can't the numbing that white supremacy requires also be transmitted, right? If I have to numb my emotions to do harm to other people and maintain my advantage, and I have to transmit fear to justify the subordination of other human beings, you're telling me that that doesn't get embedded in me biologically?
Absolutely.
I think it does. I think it gets transmitted. And so that's going to take a lot of time to undo. In the meantime, what we can do, though, I think, while we're working on unspooling that, is say to people, listen, I get it. It's scary, to think about equity and fairness when you've been used to hegemony and unfairness, because any level of sharing, any level of pluralism, not even real equity, just pluralism, just a more equitable situation feels like oppression when you've had everything, right? Or when you've had nearly everything. And so it is scary. I acknowledge that. I get it.
And not only that, but it would get you killed at some point. I mean, in history, if you tried to even reach across the lines, I mean, that was dangerous as well. I mean, physically, I think.
Well, it was. I mean, and so you're afraid, right? I mean, James Baldwin talked about the fear that white people learn about being turned away from the welcome table of white society. The theologian Tandeka talks about in her book, Learning to Be White, which is an amazing book, about how, white folks are conditioned and taught very early by parents, by their loved ones, by their caretakers, what it means to be white. And there's a separation that is presumed, and it really develops around the time of adolescence, when kids start dating. And most white folks don't have a problem when their kids play with kids that are of a different race when they're real little, when everybody's real cute, right? And the stereotypes don't really kick in. But when it starts to get to be about adolescent age, that's when that fear kicks in. That's when those white folks have been taught to you need to cleave to your own kind. And sometimes it's said directly, sometimes it's said very indirectly. It's said by the fact that, 85% of white folks live in neighborhoods with virtually no Black people around. What message does that send to the child, right? Even if their parents are very progressive politically or whatever, if they don't go to school with very many Black kids, if they don't see very many Black kids, if they don't recreate with Black kids, if they're not around Black people, the message being sent is being white means being over here, right? With our stuff and with our people, even if you're not saying that directly. And so I can get how, if you're trained to think that way, if you're really raised to think that way, the thought of moving into a different space can be scary, even if you don't buy into all the really hostile racist stereotypes. It's just the thought of change. It's just the thought of losing what you're used to. See, if you're Black or brown, you know that life is adaptation. Like Black and brown folks have always had to just sort of, figure out how to grind it out and how to create and carve out for themselves what they could. And white folks haven't had to do that. So now if you're telling me I got to share, even if you can show me that I'm not going to get hurt. I'm not going to be oppressed. We're not going to just flip over the oppression dynamic. And now we're going to be on pluralism means we're going to share everything. It's going to be better, but I'm afraid because it requires me to come out of a place that I'm used to. So what I think we have to do is, there are two options. We can either try and debunk the fear, but that's a long-term project, or we can say, listen, I get it. It's scary, but you know what's scarier sticking with what we have right now. And here's why. Actually, it's okay to be afraid, but you're fearing the wrong thing. Like the things you ought to be afraid of is what happens if you cling to this lie of white supremacy. What happens to your culture? What happens to your society? And I think there's a lot of evidence right now. COVID is a great example of it. Like the reason that we've lost 600,000 plus people and we still aren't done with this thing yet is precisely because early on in the pandemic, when the evidence came out that said this was disproportionately killing Black people in the city, you had people in the highest positions of government who were like, oh, for real, it's not us. Oh, well, then screw it. Like it's not red states. It's not small rural areas. It's not white. It's those Black people. Oh, it's Black people in New York and Chicago and LA and brown folk in LA. Oh, screw it. Let's open everything back up. We don't have to social distance. Screw that. Right. And you had all these white people showing up with guns and camo at the state capitol saying they want everything open and they don't want to stand 6 feet away from somebody at Trader Joe's because, you know, what's that? It's concentration camps and shit. So all of a sudden, why did that happen? That nonchalance came directly from the racialized antipathy toward Black bodies and Black communities. So if you say, well, it's not us, screw it, I'm going to take my foot off the brake now. We were starting to break. We were wearing masks. We were thinking about social distancing. We were shutting shit down. But, oh, wait a minute. No, it's not us. So then we take the foot off the brake. And then what happened? From April of last year, so April of 2020, in that month, 29% of the deaths from COVID were white folks. By October and November, it was 55%. Why? Because we took the foot off the brake because it was only 29% white. So we're like, oh, it's not us. And if we had cared enough about the harm being done to others, we would have said, hey, we got to shut this shit down right now. A, for their sake, because it's wrong for them to be dying so disproportionately, but B, this shit is going to get us too in like 3 months. Like just logic tells you pandemics really don't know about zip codes, right? Like they will find South Dakota, like they can find Wyoming, like pandemics don't give a shit, right? And so at some point, our indifference to Black suffering, which is part of white supremacy, leads us to follow a course of action, which now, a year later, plus 15 months later, has now resulted in what, like 52% of the overall deaths, I think, have been white folks, maybe 55%. So 300,000 plus white folks have, millions of white people have buried a loved one, in effect, because we didn't give a shit about Black death. Now, tell me again, why it is you're afraid of pluralism? Because what I'm telling you is you need to be afraid of whatever the shit is we have now, because that's why you just buried grandma. It wasn't pluralism.
It seems like you could extrapolate that too. I mean, climate change, you talk about where does climate change affecting the most, whereas all these things that you can say, okay, it's not happening to us. We've taken away their land. We've taken their resources. It's not our resources getting taken. It's not our areas getting affected. And so the world kind of is coming to a head with this globally too. I mean, you know, if racism could be the cause of everything just killing everybody. I mean, at the end of the day, and not only the example of coronavirus is a great example, but I think you can take that into so many different realms too and see how it affects us, but how we use different arguments for those things. But it really boils down to, we wouldn't let this happen to white communities, the things that we allow to happen in Black and brown communities around the world.
Right. And because look, if that headline in April of last year was April 7th, New York Times and Washington Post headline, April 7th of 2020 is where we found out that this thing was killing Black folk disproportionately, 2.5 to 3 times the rate. If that headline had said disproportionately killing white people, and for that matter, if it had said disproportionately killing younger people as opposed to older, right? If it had said disproportionately killing otherwise healthy people instead of people with pre-existing
you hear all these people talking about, it's just older or they were sick anyway.
Right.
Like,
and so,
they don't matter. They can die.
Right. So what does that tell you? It tells you that it's not just racism. It was racism and ableism and ageism.
Well, it's the lack of empathy.
Because if it had been rich folks, right? If it had been the executives, because go back to like 1918, you know, the flu pandemic that killed, you know, so many millions of people around the world. That one actually did. If you do the homework on it, you find that it did kill younger people. I don't really know why that was, but for some reason, it did kill younger people more so than
a lot of the soldiers, the young
right.
guys.
And for some reason, even when it spread, it didn't kill older people as much. I don't know why, but here's the thing. If that had happened this time, like you had these right wingers that were like Ben Shapiro saying, well, I mean, it's sad when an 82-year-old dies of COVID, but I mean, median life expectancy is just 80. So
what are we going to do?
And so my point is when you accept the disposability of Black life, right? When you say, in effect, Black life doesn't mean as much, which is a principle upon which this country is based from the beginning. Don't be surprised when that mentality of human disposability, metastasizes. And so now it isn't just Black life is worth less than white life and brown life is worth less than white life. It's also that, working class life of every color is worth less than affluent. Old is worth less than young. Sick is worth less than healthy. And the irony of that, right, is all of us are going to be sick and old at some point. All of us are going to get older. So even if you're not vulnerable now, that mentality will catch up to you. Sure. And so what I want us to think about, and you mentioned it with climate, it's a good example because all the earliest effects of climate change were being felt in Africa first and being felt in poorer, darker parts of the world. So
places that have been exploited, places that have been raped and pillaged and things for hundreds of years. I mean, the land has been just used up and taken.
Right. And so the resource exploitation that first effects there has now spread, the effects of that, the consequences of that. When you think about in this country, the opioid crisis, you can go down the list of all the things that we know were happening in other communities, and we didn't take care of business because we didn't care. We just didn't give a shit. And so now little Jimmy John down at the trailer park, can't get rehab because we just have prison cells for drug addicts. All we have is prison. And we know why. So what I want us to do is borrow, and this is the great irony of this attack right now on critical race theory. One of the important contributions of critical race theory and its real founder, Derek Bell, was his argument that, and a lot of people don't like to hear it, including white liberals, but it's true, and he documents it pretty conclusively, that all of the real progress that's ever been made in this country when it comes to racial equity didn't happen because white folks woke up, from a deep racist slumber and said, oh my gosh, we got to change our ways. It wasn't some enlightenment. It was for a few, but that wouldn't have been sufficient. What it was interest convergence, right? The realization that the interests of Black people in a given moment happened to dovetail with the interest of the larger society, including white folks. So when you think about abolition, that wasn't because Lincoln really gave a shit about Black people. He said he would have sent Black folks back to Africa if he could. It was to save the Union that he went to war. When the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 with one person sitting out the decision on Brown v. Board, it wasn't because those Supreme Court justices who had literally been segregationists like a year before had some moral awakening. It was because they realized the needs of the society demanded change. We were in the middle of a Cold War propaganda war with the Soviet Union at a time when what was happening around the world, brown and Black nations were coming out from under the heel of colonialism. How the hell are you going to sell your model to brown and Black people if you have your boot on the neck of brown and Black people? So we had to take our boot off the neck a little bit and get reform just to put on a pretty face. And I know that sounds cynical. And when Derek Bell said it, he meant it a bit cynically, but I'm saying, hey, if that's true, then we can work with that. Okay, fine. If it takes interest convergence, then where are the points right now where we might have some interest convergence? It seems like COVID is one, opioid crisis, lack of healthcare. Why do we not have universal healthcare? Well, the research is done on this. The number one thing that explains the most highly correlated factor with white opposition to universal healthcare for all is the belief that Black people will cheat the program if we had that. That is the number one most highly correlated factor for white opposition to those programs. What's the irony of that? The irony is now I don't support that because I don't want them to cheat the system, but then I don't have healthcare. Right? Or I don't have affordable healthcare. Now I'm facing medical bankruptcy, but at least those Black people didn't get one over on me. What the hell kind of thing is that? Right? So we have to talk in those terms of interest convergence. And I know there are people who don't like to hear that. There are white liberals who don't like to hear it. There are also Black and brown folk who I respect greatly, who don't like to hear that because they feel rightly so that white folks ought to oppose white supremacy because it's a moral abomination. I get that. It is. And that ought to be enough. But I have been white for 52 years, and 52 years is long enough to know that if you're going to put all of your chips on that marker called white folks get a conscience this week, you're a much more ambitious gambler than I am. I've been white long enough to know I'm not going to put all my chips on a white moral awakening. I don't mean to say that white people individually don't have those from time to time. But the idea that white America writ large is just going to go, oh, shit, I forgot to create equality. No, come on, man. We have been led to believe that this is in our interest. And unless we can show that it's not, that our interest is a collective interest that is fed by justice, I don't think we're going to get movement. So for those people who don't want white folks to have to make it about our self-interest, or not self, but connected interest convergence, you better hope that Black folk can get it on their own without any allyship. And if that's true, go for it. Like, great. I don't know that I buy that. Or you better hope that there's some moral awakening. And I just think the odds of that are pretty slim.
No, absolutely. But we talk about the world kind of being set up and racism kind of building the world that we have right now. What does it look like without racism? I mean, does everything fall apart? It's pretty much, we've got all this bubble, this dreamy bubble of opulence here based upon the exploitation of people. How do you, let's say you achieve the goal. Everybody, we find some way to the promised land and the bridge to equity and things. How does the world look? I mean, what does that look like?
I don't know, but let's find out, right? Yeah. Like whatever it is, it's got to be more sustainable and better than this. I suspect, look, you're right. I mean, if the wealth of the white West has been built on exploitation, and it has been, then by definition, whatever comes after that system is going to be less opulent. At least in relative terms. I don't know, the idea that it all is zero sum is not necessarily true. It might be that a more equitable society would be a more productive society. It might be that we actually grow the pie when we are more equitable. There is some research to suggest that societies that are more equal actually do better at producing the needs to meet the things that meet the needs of all those people. So we might actually grow the pie, but yeah, is it possible that we will be a less opulent society where some folk are going to have to do with quite a bit less? Yeah, I would imagine that.
Really, I imagine. I mean, you like the growth exponentially on a personal level and on a community level has got to be it's got to be light years ahead, but and you think about the kind of vapid material consumer culture, it doesn't really give us so much contentment anyway. I mean, it doesn't really fill us up as humans with some great, we may think it does, and we may use these temporary purchases to kind of give us a little spike, a little addictive spike so that we're not depressed all the time in our disconnection. But I would, I like what you said. I think let's find out. I mean, I think it would probably lead to some different level. And not only that, but more heads at the table, more brilliance at the table. You think there'd be more graceful solutions as well. So whatever came up, we would handle it gracefully a little bit more if everybody.
Well, and less stress. I mean, part of the stress of this culture is precisely the stress that is generated by profound inequality, right? So if you grow up in a society of profound inequality, we'll just keep it on an economic level for a second before we even think about it in terms of race. You grow up in a highly unequal economic system. If you're on the top, you're constantly anxious about staying there, and you're always looking behind you to see who's gaining on you. If you're in the middle, you're real anxious because you want to be like these people up here, and you're afraid of these people down here, and you're afraid of falling. So you're just trying to make sure you're climbing up the ladder. And if you're on the bottom, you are being told by that society, at least in this one, that the reason you're down there is because something wrong with you. So now you're beating yourself up. There's at every level, top, middle, and bottom, there is a stress that comes with that level of inequality that isn't healthy for anybody. There's a reason the United States has the highest of all industrialized nations, and even compared to nations that are in the middle of civil wars right now, and over the last 10 or 15 years, higher rates of diagnosable mental illness and emotional disorder. Now, I know there are folks who would say, well, the DSM is not necessarily good for non-Western culture, so maybe that's not an accurate gauge. But no matter how you define mental and emotional distress, we have more of it. Why? We're the wealthiest nation. We're the most powerful nation. We have all of this power, all this technology, and we are profoundly unhappy. That is either the weirdest coincidence ever, right? That like you can have all that power and all that strength and still be unhappy, or the power and the strength is what's making you unhappy, right? That you actually are having a hard time coping because the stress of that inequality is what gets to you. And on a racial level, that's the stress, right? If white folks have been conditioned to believe that we are deserving of our position and that these people down here are deserving of theirs, then obviously any possibility that some of them are going to come up here, right? And that some of us may be down here and that we may be on a more level plane. By definition, that's going to scare the crap out of a lot of white people, because if you believe that they're really inferior, then your only way of interpreting that, even if you don't believe it consciously, but if you even just believe it at some subconscious level, your only way of interpreting a move toward greater equity is, oh shit, our society is not going to be sustainable. And you may not want to say that outwardly because you know that sounds bad, but like internally, there's a subconscious message that's being sent. And so what kind of stress does that cause? That creates the tension that we have right now. That's not healthy for anybody.
And so many white people keep that tension anyway, just because we're not rich as we think we should be, or we're not this thing that we're taught where is our destiny. If we just work hard enough, we're all supposed to be these millionaires and these Trumps and whatever. Everybody thinks that they're just one step away, one decision away. You can have it if you just try hard enough, and it doesn't affect, that's a without even having to worry about anybody else trying to come up and take a piece of it as well. But I mean, I think just in the sense of the lessening the distress of Black and brown people and the death and the carnage that's happened for so long, just having that underlying everything we do is bad for everybody. I mean, it's obviously for Black and brown people, it's been devastating, and just to alleviate that would be the best thing ever for everybody, I think, in general, just spirits, hearts, minds, everything. And whatever else came, we could figure out the rest of it. It's kind of like, let's do it.
Right.
So, I mean, we talk about Michelle Alexander told about your recent book, Dispatches from the Race War. This is a question I thought of earlier about challenging white folks' truth. And this is what we're talking about here too, the truth that we're told white folks. So your book, I just want you to talk a little bit about your new book and tell me about how you get the brainchild for that. How'd you come up with it, and what are you trying to put out? I mean, what do you?
Well, I mean, that book is a product of my laziness in one sense. And what I mean by that is, rather than write a new book with its own thesis and development, I just was like, I'm just going to put all these old essays together and crank out an essay collection, right? So there's a little bit of laziness. I'm going to be honest, it's sort of a lack of work ethic. I could have probably done better, but no, I felt as though I had done an essay collection back in 2009. Right after Obama was elected. And I thought, here we are, we've just come out of 8 years of the Obama presidency. And at the time that I was putting the collection together, coming toward the end of the Trump presidency. And I just felt like a lot had happened, obviously, since that last collection of essays, good, bad, and awful, that needed to be reflected upon in a collection, so we could look at the trajectory of how the country had moved and not moved, how it had changed and not changed, how it had progressed and regressed at the same time over that 12 years. And so the collection begins with an essay that I wrote literally the night of Obama's election. And then it tracks that period and various, racial issues that emerged during the Obama years, going into the Trump years. And then there are some chapters that sort of span both of those eras that deal with white denial, that deal with historical memory, things of that nature. I just wanted to have all that in one place so that people can see this arc of mini history over that 12-year period and realize how central race and race issues are to virtually everything that happens in America. That has always been true, but the last 12 years have really highlighted why and how that's true. And so I was hoping that these essays, all of which had been pre-published somewhere, would help to illustrate that.
Time capsules that just kind of, time capsule. You drop them on they're very timely at the time, and to see the trajectory of all those thoughts kind of.
I felt that would be helpful, and it would also buy me some time to come up with a new idea for a real book, so I'm working on that.
But man, I know you got ideas for days. What's the new? Are you on anything new? Are you real excited about, like, you have something that is bubbling, or what's going on?
I mean, so, it's weird, right? In this COVID era, I've sort of, like a lot of people, I'm sure, have felt in a bit of suspended animation when it comes to projects. And I probably should have been using this time to really develop all of these great ideas. I've got a bunch, but I'm really scattered. The one that I think now, that I want us to look at is with this new attack on anti-racist education. I'm not even going to call it critical race theory, because really what they're attacking is not even that.
Right, sure.
It's just any form of anti-racist education or anti-racist analysis. The state of Texas recently released a thing that said, if your child is in a classroom where they use the word ally, it's probably critical race theory. I mean, it's just words now, like the word ally, the word justice, the word equity, the word diversity. I mean, these words that don't necessarily even mean anything, or can mean everything, and therefore sort of meaningless, are now supposedly evidence of evil. With this attack, I'm really concerned about how we have responded. Most of the response, it seems, has been this very intellectual laughing at the right, saying, "Oh, you people, you don't even know what critical race theory is." Well, that's not gonna win this moment, right? If the other side's attacking it, using the phrase wrong, using the term wrong, and all we're doing is trying to explain the finer points of Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectional thesis or the finer points of Derek Bell's ideology, we're gonna lose. What we've got to do is flip the script on that conversation. And so the other day I wrote a piece that sort of prefaces a little bit what I think my new book is going to be, which is saying, listen, here's the problem. If you reject critical race theory and you reject the argument of anti-racist, which is racism is a systemic force deeply ingrained in the American soul and soil, if you reject that, it's your prerogative, but you have to then come up with an alternative explanation for why we have such profound inequalities. And the only one left is that there's something wrong with Black people, right? If it's not America, it's Black folks. And so what I want us to do is say, the critical race theory and anti-racist theory is not the problem theory. The problem is conservative race theory, because the only one y'all got left is inherently racist. If you're not willing to say that inequality is about systemic injustice, what is your explanation? Because that's it. It's the bell curve. It's the idea that Black people are culturally defective. I want to force right-wing people to defend that bullshit, because to me, that's the only way that we can really have this discussion, is you're either. So when Kendi and others say you got to be either racist or anti-racist, that's what he's talking about, right? You have to either realize the problem is systemic, or you have to acknowledge that you believe Black people are an inferior species of or culture of humanity. And if that's where you're at, I need to know that right now. I need to know who you are and where you are, because you're not somebody that I look to reason with. You're just somebody I look to defeat.
But that seems like a very quick to the point argument when you get into conversations with folks. It's like, okay, well, why are these issues? What do you explain? If this is not the reason, why? What is your explanation for these things? And then you can kind of cut to the chase right off bat and see where people's heads at. Check the temperature quick.
Right. And then to me, the thing is, we have to provide the pushback to that. I'm not really interested in, if you actually are willing to do the bell curve argument, I'm not going to waste my time with that bullshit. But the more dangerous argument is the cultural one. That's the one that most people use, right? It used to be, racism early on, white supremacy had a spiritual foundation. It was, these heathens are cut off from the salvific balm of God because they are not Christians, blah, blah, blah. And then they started becoming Christians, and it was like, well, shit, that won't work anymore. So now it must be scientific, right? They're inferior because they haven't evolved. And then after World War II, when it got sort of, messy to argue biological supremacy, we shifted to the culture argument, which was, well, it's not that they're inherently inferior. It's just, their cultures, their families, their community. Now we want to blame everything on hip hop, blame everything on single parenthood, blame everything on Black folks don't want to work hard. They're too criminally inclined, all these cultural arguments, which are easily debunked. If you actually look at the evidence, they're not accurate. But I just want to force people out of their cave where they're hiding behind those beliefs. That's what they think. They just don't want to say it. I want to force you to say it. So then we can actually have that conversation, because their whole argument is it's racist to say white people have privilege. How is it racist to say white people have privilege, but it's not racist to say Black families are defective? Like how is that? Like all we're doing is making a sociological argument. You're making a characterological argument. That's racist. We're just trying to describe social reality. We might be right, we might be wrong. If you want to take your shot and say, oh, there's no white privilege and here's my evidence, cool, we can have that debate. But if you're arguing Black culture is defective, you are by definition a racist, and I need to hang that label on you so we know exactly who's in and who's out of the club as we try to move forward and create democracy.
Oh, absolutely. That's if you can get to that, is that, have you done, is it easy to do? Have you worked on that?
I don't know if it's going to be easy, but it's what I want to work on, for this next little bit of time and try to, because there really hasn't been a comprehensive rebuttal. And I don't just mean fact and data based, although it will have lots of data and facts in it for the people who do respond to that. I mean, even just analytically, I want to talk through why these cultural arguments are so offensive and so wrong and so racist, because I think people try to carve out a space where that's not racist, where they can say, oh, it's not that I think all Black people are inferior. I just think that in general, the Black community is blah, blah, blah. And, but there are a lot of reasons why that's still incredibly racist. If you believe that, for instance, how can you convince me or anybody else that you're really going to treat any Black person who applies for a job at your business equally? If you actually think that Black communities are defective and you're a teacher teaching Black children, how are you going to view that Black child as a potential genius? You're not. If you're a cop and you believe that Black folks are defective, how are you going to treat Black people in the community as law-abiding citizens until proven otherwise? How are you going to treat them as human beings? You're not. And so we have to get to a point where we critique this cultural argument just as strongly as we critique the biological argument and the genetic argument. And we haven't really critiqued that one enough either, but we really got to deal with the culture piece. And that to me is the thing that we have not quite done yet. Those of us in the anti-racist community, we just sometimes have left it with the biological argument. There were a lot of good rebuttals when the bell curve came out, a lot of good academic research that came out that said this is bullshit and here's why, and debunked a lot of the extremist science that was being used, quote unquote science that was being used. But a lot of the cultural arguments are accepted even by relatively liberal people. You'll hear relatively liberal folks talk about, well, Black people, they need to be less dependent on welfare.
We worked our way out of the conversation. White people created this system that created these circumstances, and Black people were affected. And then Black people now have this issue, but white people are slowly kind of taking our, white out of the conversation. Now it's Black people have this issue in their community, but the conversation starts somewhere different, and over time that we've kind of left the scene of the crime here and
exactly
Black people. So
exactly, because the whole cultural argument assumes, and this is another reason why it's racist, if you assume that Black culture in America has evolved independent of white supremacy, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing has evolved independent of white supremacy. So whether we're talking about white American culture, Black American culture, any kind of subculture within America has taken place against a backdrop of racial inequity, disparity, and white supremacy. So whatever you want to say is going on in Black communities, which, by the way, you're exaggerating and you're stereotyping and you're wrong about, but even the parts of your analysis that have nuggets of truth have to be connected to the system, the material system within which culture developed. Culture is not this freestanding thing, right? That just exists in a vacuum. It develops within the material conditions of the society. And that has been true in not just for Black folk, that's been true for every white immigrant group. That's been true for, if you look right now, best example of this, right, is that all across this country and really throughout the West in general, fertility rates, birth rates are declining rapidly. They've been declining in this country rapidly since the early 1970s in every racial and ethnic group. Why? Because we know that when society opens up opportunities for women and girls, there will be a postponement of marriage, a postponement of childbearing, because there are opportunities, right? If I didn't have any opportunities 100 years ago, I had to attach myself to a man if I was a heterosexual, and even if I wasn't heterosexual, because of the way that the system was so, obviously heterosexist, I had to attach myself to some man, even if I didn't love him, just because otherwise I was going to be in my parents' house forever and I was going to get mocked as an old maid and all this bullshit that we used to do, right? And so what happens is, as women get more opportunities, thankfully, they have options. One of those options is, I'm not going to have 7 kids now. I'm not going to have 4 kids now. I might not have any kids now. So the fertility rates have dropped. Is that because American culture developed in a vacuum? No, it was in relation to the material conditions for women and for girls. And when we see that happening in other countries, the same thing happens. As women and girls have more opportunity in any country on earth, you will see fertility rates decline. So you could make an argument, and some would, well, there's a culture of not having baby. No, it's not a culture of reduced fertility. It's an economic and cultural reality that's connected to the opportunity structure. When people have more opportunity, they do certain things. When they have less opportunity, they do certain things. And we've seen that all throughout history. A great example I like to point out is if you go back to the 30s and the 40s in this country, and you ask people, okay, who do you think dominated professional basketball in the 1930s and the 1940s? Now, people know that it wouldn't have been Black folks yet because they wouldn't have been, allowed to play in professional basketball, right? But most people don't realize it wasn't just white people, like generically, it was Jews, right? Jewish folks actually dominated professional basketball. Now, if you say that now, people will be like, what? That just seems weird to us. And as a Jewish person, I'm like, well, I was good at basketball until I realized I had to be taller than 5'8", and then I was done, right? But for real, that was who dominated. And what's funny is there were all these theories that sports writers, there was a sports writer, Paul Gallico, who was a notorious bigot. And he said at one point that, I don't know if he was a notorious bigot, but he said some really bigoted stuff. And what he said was, at the time, he said that the reason Jews were good at basketball was because basketball was a sport that relied on trickiness and deception, right? So you had the bounce pass and you had the fake pass. And so because it was a sport that relied on trickiness and deception were stereotypes about Jews, that's why Jews were so good at it. Well, what it really was that at that time, if you were Jewish, a lot of avenues were cut off to you in this country. So you could go into entertainment and you could go into sports because those were things that were more open to talent, right? It was more of a meritocracy than banking. It was more of a meritocracy than accountants. It was more of a meritocracy than being a lawyer. So you could go into certain areas. And then as Jewish folks matriculated into the club of whiteness, and we became more accepted as just another offshoot of white people, then other opportunities opened up and we're like, okay, we're done with basketball now because we got this other shit, right? And but it wasn't Jewish culture that explained that. It was the material conditions within which Jews in the 30s and 40s were operating, right? So that's an important example. Like, we just can't make these cultural assumptions about people when we take it out of a historical context.
So these conversations need to be heard by people who need to hear them, right? And I know that the tough part about getting that conversation into the right place is having those talks where you have to go on like a Fox News, or you have to go in front of these conservative groups. I mean, it's good for everyone, obviously, to hear these things and to have this conversation, but there's a big swath of the population that, as you're formulating your newest line of argument, which makes a lot of sense, and I think if a lot of people heard that, they would have to think about it and have to question it. Yeah. You've had death threats, you've had people, obviously throughout the course of your history, really threatened by what you say and what you're talking about. And how do you take that on? I mean, how do you present this in front of groups that may need to hear it and have that argument presented where they can actually kind of maybe come to some sort of different decision on it without getting yourself killed?
Well, to be honest, I don't worry a lot about trying to put that argument out to the hardcore conservative right-wing people. I'm of the opinion that we sometimes spend too much time trying to do the conversion narrative, right? Trying to get right-wingers to see the error of their ways, or trying to get overt racists to see the error of their ways. It happens sometimes that you can make inroads with those folks, but I just think that by and large, that's not the best use of our time. So even this book that I've just described that I want to work on now, I am working on, I don't really anticipate that being aimed at like a readership of Fox News and One American News Network and Newsmax people. I mean, if some of them end up seeing it and it, great, wonderful. But I'm more interested in crafting these narratives, whether it's in essay form or book form, for two other reasons other than conversion. One is inoculation, right? So think about, even we think about the COVID vaccine, we know that that's not going to cure you if you already have it, but it might inoculate you with some boosters needed down the road against another round of it, right? Okay. And so I think of this as well. This can be inoculation. There are millions of people, especially young people, right, who are online. They're on chat boards, they're in private chat rooms, they're on video game servers, they're on, 4chan, 8chan, they're on social media, and they're being hit with a lot of really overtly racist shit. And I don't think that we've done enough to inoculate them against that, right? It isn't that all of them are going to become anti-racist activists. A lot of people are never going to be activists. It's just not who they are. We don't need everybody to necessarily be in the street yelling for justice. We just need to make sure that we're not having a new generation of young people co-opted by the far right and by fascism. That too is a victory. So if we can get some of this anti-racist thinking into the hands and the heads of neutral people who are neutral right now, who don't really know what to think or have never thought about this, that can be like an inoculation that can prevent them from becoming a problem. And that's an important piece. The second thing is getting these narratives in the hands of other reasonably liberal and progressive people who still need a reminder of why this is so important, right? I remember being a young person when I was like 18, 19, going to college. And I remember if you asked me, let's say back in the day, how do you feel about like affirmative action, right? Which is a very minor equity initiative, but an important one. And that's why it's under attack. I would have told you, oh, I'm for it. But if you had really asked me like, well, can you defend it? Like I probably could have done better than most because I came out of a debate background. I wouldn't have felt super confident until I started reading some really amazing, important history stuff, sociology stuff, right? And then I started formulating my ideas. So it made me a better advocate because I was exposed, right? And so if we can get this analysis, an anti-racist analysis, in the hands of people who say they're progressive and anti-racist, but maybe don't have the courage of their convictions, it can give them the courage of their convictions. When you have the courage of your convictions, you're a better organizer. You're a better activist. You're more likely to go out and vote. You're more likely to go out and do other stuff, community organizing, whatever it is. You're more likely to talk to your neighbor or talk to your family member or challenge them. If you don't feel confident doing that because you don't have the information, right, you might shy away from these discussions. We can't afford that. So I'm not necessarily worried about taking people from the church of the right wing and putting them in the church of the left wing, so to speak. I just am interested in inoculation and mobilization. That makes a lot of sense. That should be enough.
That it's just such an outsized influence on the country, the right wing. I mean, it's such a minority, but with such, I mean, through all the gerrymandering, through all the electoral college, through all that stuff, it seems like throughout the history of the country, people like yourself and people like myself who try to create this change, people like everybody who try to create a change, you keep coming up against this wall every time. I mean, it's like every 20 years, there's a new revolution. Every 20 years, there's a new movement. And the outsized influence of this group, somehow it has to be cut down or somehow it has to be neutralized in some way or another, right? I mean, doesn't that seem like, how do you do that without taking it directly to that group? Or how do you do that without directly dividing it up or breaking down that power structure?
Well, I mean, you do have to break down that power structure. It's just a question of what's your path to that. And I think the difference is there are a lot of people who think that the path to that is by, getting a bunch of people to totally change their views. And if people want to do that, I'm all for it. But I think the bigger thing is, look, politics is about power and it is about numbers. And the reality is some people on the left sometimes we get very squeamish around power because we want to build bridges, and people on the progressive side of things want everybody to be on the same page. We want to have community, and we want to have, and I'm all for that. But the reality is sometimes you just got to steamroll folks, and you have to, and the only way that you're going to do that is by building up your own base of people, mobilizing them, keeping them out there doing the work, and inoculating those truly sort of middle ground people. So some of them will come over to your side, but at the very least, you don't want them going over to the other side. And then you just have to work harder and smarter and out organize people, because the problems that you just identified are that's the proof that the problem is systemic. The fact that we keep having to recreate this struggle every generation, right, proves the systemic nature of the problem. That was the whole point of critical race theory, was to answer one question. The whole reason it was developed is to answer the question, why is it that in spite of the very real victories of the civil rights era, these profound inequities remain in place and not that much has changed? That was the question that the crits were trying to answer. And the answer was, well, because the problem is deeper than that. The problem is systemic and it's ingrained. And then the right wing's answer was, well, the problem is Black people. And so that's where we're at, is making sure people understand the systemic nature. The reason that the filibuster is so hard to change, the reason that the Electoral College is so hard to change, the reason that we have 2 senators per state so that the state of Wyoming has more representation on a per capita basis by what, like 20 times more representation than California or something. These are all things that have remained in place, not only because they serve white supremacy. I'm not gonna say that's the only reason, but trust me, they serve white supremacy. If they didn't, they would have been gone, right? If they did not serve to maintain that system, they would have been eradicated, but they work really well to empower a group that is increasingly not the majority of the country, a group that is diminishing in terms of population, but whose political power has not diminished commensurate with the population size. And so that's why those things remain in place. That's the systemic nature of the problem. And we have to get people to think in those terms, which itself is difficult because our culture is constructed on the idea that the individual is the unit of analysis, right? In everything, we're hyper individualistic as a culture. So whatever it is, good or bad, is about good people or bad people. And so if we can just make people better, then the problem will go away. Well, I mean, yeah, if you could do that, but people are messed up, man. All of us are messed up. We're all flawed and damaged people. And what damages us, it really is the systems within which we operate. We get conditioned by those systems. We're growing up in a culture right now that absolutely trains us all to accept inequality, right? The fact that people turn against it is a miracle, because the system says, why would you do that? This country says, as its number one guiding principle, the cornerstone of our secular gospel, Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism is what? Anybody can make it in America if they try hard. So if you didn't make it, it's your own damn fault, right? Anybody can make it. If you believe that, and you've never been taught how to think about that, how to interrogate that, how to challenge and push back on that, then you're going to look around and you're going to see inequality and you're going to go, well, shit, what can we do, right? I mean, they just must not work as hard. So rationalization, justification of inequality is the coin of the realm in this culture. That is so getting people to challenge that, man, it's like going into church and right after the minister has just done the sermon, standing up in the third row of pews or whatever and being like, hey, that was lovely, but there's no God, right? So why are we here? Like, that doesn't go over well. And the same is true when you push back on that notion of meritocracy and rugged individualism. But if we don't push back on that, this thing is not going to change. That's the task in front of us.
Now, quick question, and I know this is, I asked for an hour and I don't want to overextend my time here, but all if you don't mind me, just another question. How, on a personal note, Tim Wise, you've been doing this work for a long time, but those things that you talked about right there are ingrained in our systems. And as a white man, how has your journey been, or your struggle been, with the things that are impressed upon us that we're not always aware of, or, the idea that meritocracy and the judgmental nature that is kind of pushed into us? How is that, and how does that continue? How do you continue to work on your own whiteness and your own maleness?
Well, I mean, part of that, it's a lifelong struggle to actually remind myself of the role of my identities as a white person, as a man, as a heterosexual, a cisgendered person, a college-educated person, someone who's now economically stable. I'm not going to say affluent, but stable, and to where I don't have to look at the receipt on the ATM anymore to know that I've got some money in there. So that's a stability that I didn't have growing up. I have to remind myself that truth, all of those truths are connected to identity. My success is only partly about my work. Like I told you earlier, my work ethic is not real good. If it was, I would have written 20 books. If I would have gotten a lot more accomplished if I really had a good work ethic. But I've worked just hard enough and had the advantages of whiteness and maleness and all those things to amplify my voice. And I have to remain humble about that. I think part of the work for all of us is a degree of radical humility. And I don't just mean for white men. I mean, like generally in American culture, we don't have enough humility vis-a-vis the rest of the world. People who are affluent, regardless of race, don't have enough humility vis-a-vis working class and lower income poor folk. People who are straight don't have enough humility, and cisgendered vis-a-vis LGBTQ folk. People, just humans, don't have enough humility vis-a-vis non-human species and the way we exploit them and damage them. So we need a kind of humility that can put in perspective where we are, like in our path of life. And even our knowledge, we need to be humble about. Like, even to the extent we want to take credit for some of our individual successes. Well, let's say, what's the source of that credit? Well, I studied really hard and I worked. Well, okay, but somebody had to write those books that you read when you were studying. Somebody had to do that work that you then learned from. You had to have teachers that taught you. So like all these books behind me right here, which I did not read them all, by the way. So sometimes people are like, you read? No, I didn't read all these.
That's impressive.
They just look really good on the shelf and I'm trying to get to them all. But the point is, even if I read them all and I had like this huge base of knowledge, well, okay, but that wouldn't just be me, right? It would be all these authors. It would be all these people who provided me with that knowledge. So even that I would need to be humble about. I was fortunate to have certain people come into my life as mentors, as teachers, that exposed me to certain things. I had a mom that put me in a preschool that was, mostly Black kids at a historically Black college in the early childhood ed program there. That shaped my understanding of peer groups. It shaped my understanding of authority figures because it was mostly Black women running the show there. Like that, I didn't do anything to deserve that, right? I just got really lucky to have that and have that open my eyes to some things which 99% of white people who don't have that wouldn't get. Like, that's not, I don't get any credit for that. I can't be like, look how smart I am because I understand whiteness. What? No, I mean, that's just, I'm really lucky. I'm not any smarter than anybody else when it comes to that, but I've been exposed to some things. And so if we can have some humility around how we came to understand whatever it is we understand, how we came to succeed at whatever it is we've been successful at, it would change the whole dynamic of the culture. Because right now, what makes it so easy not to push for change is that conceit that says, I got mine, y'all get yours. Right? And if I understand that I could have been y'all and you could have been me, and if I hadn't had some good fortune and luck and some unearned privilege, my life would be very, very different. And if someone else had that luck that I had, or had the privilege that I had, then they would have been where I'm at, right? So you can't get haughty about where you are in life. And unfortunately, we live in a culture that encourages that haughtiness, that encourages that ego, that encourages that lack of humility more than probably any culture on earth. And that's going to be a hard slog, I think, for those of us who are trying to create equity, but that is what the task is. And that's why it's important to talk about humility as a value, not to take away from people's hard work, but to say, look, man, most people work hard in a society where you have to, or you die. Most people work hard. Most people around the world work hard. People that live in poor countries work harder than I've ever worked. Right. But they don't have what I have. So it's not about saying, my great grandfather, when he came here from Russia, a stereotypical Jewish immigrant with 18 cents and a ball of lint in his pocket, or whatever the hell story we like to tell. I worked 18 hours a day, but he also was able to get jobs right off the boat in New York City when he got here that had been off limits to Black folk for 35 years. That doesn't take away from his hard work for me to acknowledge that. It just means that I'm going to put his hard work in a box marked opportunity structure, right? Like he was met with an opportunity structure which helped facilitate that hard work and make it pay off. That's not a slap at him. It's a way of saying, man, imagine what other folks could have done if their hard work had been met with that same opportunity structure.
Imagine what the world would look like. Imagine where we'd be. You know, I always talk about being on some Star Trek. You know, we could be on a whole nother galaxies, understandings of the universe, whatever, if that were the case. Yeah, I think on some levels. Right. Well, hey, man, I don't want, again, I gave you an amount of time. I don't want to overextend my welcome here, but I can't thank you enough for all this brilliance and really taking the time to spend with me and the folks that are going to be listening to this podcast. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of great response and hopefully, you know, we can come back and do this again sometime. I'd love to have you on as things progress and you got new things going on.
Sounds good. I hope to get back to Fayetteville and we'll do this in person sometime.
That'd be great, man. I'm looking forward to that.
So, all right, cool. Take care.
Cool. Thanks, Tim.
All right, man.
Bye.
See ya.